Most haunted house stories begin with a strange noise, a knock in the night, a creaking floorboard, a shadow glimpsed from the corner of someone's eye. The Great Amherst Mystery is different. It didn't begin with the subtle, creepy things here and there. It began with violence. Not violence from a ghost, violence from a living man. And according to those who witnessed what happened afterward, that single act may have unleashed one of the strangest paranormal cases ever recorded. Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the downright eerie. Before we get into today's story, just know that while all of our tales are based on true events, sometimes sources conflict and details get skewed with time, so just take this as entertainment. The town of Amherst was not the sort of place where people expected mysteries. In the late 19th century, it was a growing industrial town surrounded by forests, farms, and rolling countryside. Life was generally predictable. People worked, raised families, attended church. The community was pretty close, and most people were quick to share news with neighbors, so rumors traveled especially quickly because there wasn't really much else to talk about. Which is why the strange events that began in the summer of 1878 spread through town so rapidly. The Teed family was among the residents of Amherst, and they lived in a modest home with several relatives all under the same roof. One of those was a young woman named Esther Cox. And one day, Esther experienced something traumatic. A local man named Bob McNeil had become interested in her, and while she was flattered, Esther really didn't feel the same way about him at all. But on August 28th, 1878, McNeil finally convinced her to go on a carriage ride with him. But somewhere along their conversations, possibly even before the ride, it became clear that Esther would never see him as a potential romantic partner. And this had enraged McNeil. He drove the carriage to a remote spot and pulled out a pistol and pointed it at Esther. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears as she's looking at him, wondering what he's going to do to her. And McNeil orders her out of the carriage, and at first she's stunned and terrified, but she resists. Finally, though, he does manage to get her out. But as he does, Esther hears this clacking in the distance getting closer. And at first McNeil ignores it, but soon another wagon comes into view, and Esther makes a mad dash for it. At that, McNeil tucks away his pistol and gets back in the carriage and just kind of rode off, sort of trying to pretend nothing ever happened. And rain began to pour as Esther got into the other wagon. She was still stunned at what happened and didn't really want to talk about it, but she was able to tell them where she lived and make it back home. When she arrived, she was drenched, but other than that, physically all right. However, she was emotionally devastated. After that day, she became withdrawn. She became a very nervous person and was easily startled. The experience seemed to leave a permanent mark. Weeks after the attack, Esther was sharing a room with her sister, Olive. The night started out pretty ordinary. Esther changed into her nightclothes and laid down in bed, pulling the covers up tight around her. The house was quiet and everyone was asleep when Esther began hearing a faint noise coming from under the bed. She listened closely, and it sounded like scratching, like maybe a mouse trying to dig through the floor. She whispered to her sister, asking if she heard that noise too, to which her sister said, "Yeah, what is that?" And they both continued listening, and it started getting louder and louder until the sound filled the whole room. And suddenly, the bed began violently shaking. And the two women were terrified. They leapt out of bed and scrambled to light their lamp, and when they did, they began looking all around the room, just trying to figure out what happened. But there was nothing there. No animal or intruder, and the shaking stopped as abruptly as it began. And so the sisters kind of tried to calm themselves down, and they eventually convinced themselves that it had been some strange but harmless occurrence. They didn't know what it was, but they were okay, so they just kind of laid back down and went to sleep, hoping nothing else would happen. A few days later, Esther awoke feeling ill, like very ill. Her family gathered around her bed, afraid that she was having a medical emergency, and as they sat there trying their best to take care of her and be a comfort to her, something started to happen. Something impossible. Esther's body began to swell. Her whole body was inflating. Her skin became flushed, and she started having trouble breathing. And the family's shocked at what they're looking at. They're looking at Esther and each other and just trying to wrap their heads around what's happening. But while they're talking, there's a sudden loud bang. It startled everyone, and they look at Esther like, did that noise come from her? Did her skin burst somehow? But then there's another loud bang, and another. The noises appeared to come from inside the walls themselves, and the entire room shook. Pictures rattled on the wall, furniture vibrated, but for all the force of whatever this was, nobody could figure out exactly where it was coming from. And the sounds continued throughout the night. Some compared them to hammer blows, and others described them like gunshots, but either way, every attempt to locate the source failed. Word of Esther's illness eventually reached a local physician, a man named Dr. Carit. He was asked to examine her, and when he arrived, he began evaluating Esther's condition. He checks her heartbeat and listens to her breathing. He checks out her skin, the flush, swelling, and he's going through the motions when a loud noise erupted from inside the room, almost startling him off of his feet. And the doctor searched for the source, but he couldn't pin it down. He couldn't tell just where it was coming from, but it did sound like it was in the walls. And moments later, another bang echoed through the house. And then another. The sound seemed to move, as though something invisible was sort of traveling through the walls. The doctor watched as a piece of plaster from the ceiling broke and fell. And he finished up his examination as quickly as he could, but he did leave without finding any medical explanation for what was going on with Esther. News traveled quickly in a small town, especially when it's something as strange as this. And soon neighbors began visiting the house. Some came out of concern, but others came out of just curiosity. Many arrived thinking it was some sort of hoax, and they kind of just wanted to figure it out. And they thought strange stories kind of have a way of growing larger with each retelling, so most of this is probably just exaggeration. But many of them left shaken. Not only did they hear the banging and the various knocks, they felt the rumble of the walls and floorboards. The house slowly transformed into a local attraction where ordinary citizens gathered in hopes of witnessing something impossible. By the fall of 1878, the strange events surrounding Esther Cox had become the talk of Amherst. People discussed the case in shops, they whispered about it after church, workers talked about it in factories and along the railroad. Some were convinced a supernatural force was haunting the young woman, while others believed she was faking the whole thing. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: something really strange was happening. The problem was that the disturbances no longer seemed confined to Esther's bedroom. They were spreading, and according to witnesses, they were becoming increasingly aggressive. At first, the noises had been limited to the house. Loud bangs, unexpected thuds, but now people claimed that the phenomenon followed Esther wherever she went. If she visited a neighbor's house, the noises appeared there. If she spent time with relatives, those strange events happened there. And the pattern began to terrify her family because it suggested that the house wasn't haunted, Esther was. Some witnesses swore that they heard sharp knocks that seemed to answer questions. One knock for yes, two knocks for no. At times the sound appeared intelligent and purposeful, as though something unseen was listening and responding. Whether that was actually happening or whether frightened witnesses were interpreting random sounds as communication is pretty hard to say, but the reports continued, and they became harder to dismiss. Soon the activity escalated beyond strange noises. Objects began moving on their own. Visitors would see household items just launched across the rooms. Furniture slid across the floor. On a few occasions, something was thrown by whatever this was, would change direction midair. A couple of times, things were flung hard enough that they struck the walls with enough force to leave dents. The incidents occurred so frequently that many visitors began entering the home just expecting to see something happen. Then came one of the most famous incidents in the entire case. A loud scraping sound suddenly echoed through a room. A visitor standing nearby turned toward the wall to see if they could tell what it was, like where it was coming from. And slowly, they saw the words beginning to appear on the plaster, like an invisible hand was writing them. And the message said, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." The words remained visible long enough for multiple people to see them, and needless to say, the message terrified everyone there. And the story spread like wildfire through Amherst, with fear coming with it. The most disturbing reports involved direct assaults on Esther herself. She was repeatedly attacked by an invisible force. Pins appeared in strange places, like they were traps set for her. Things would fly across the room and hit her at random. She was scratched, poked, hit. On several occasions, family and friends watched her being physically pulled or shoved without anyone touching her. At times, Esther screamed in pain while the family members just searched frantically for an attacker that they couldn't see. The accounts became increasingly dramatic and increasingly difficult to verify. And the case may have faded into local folklore if not for one man. His name was Walter Hubble. Walter Hubble was not a scientist, a priest, or even a doctor. He was an actor and an amateur investigator with just this deep interest in unusual phenomenon. And when he heard about Esther's case, he traveled to Amherst to see it for himself. At first, he expected everything that he had heard was just drastically over-exaggerated, maybe even outright fraud. But what he found fascinated him. He interviewed witnesses, he watched Esther, he moved through the house. If the disturbances were real, he wanted to witness them firsthand. And that he did. The knocks happened very frequently, and Hubble investigated, but much like everyone else, he couldn't find a source. But what really amazed him was seeing things move. Chairs, hairbrushes, candlesticks, all with no one touching them. He even witnessed a pocket knife that launched across the room as if on its own. Again and again, Hubble insisted that fraud could not account for what he was seeing. Though some critics would argue that Hubble had become emotionally invested in the story and that he wanted the mystery to be real, so he just kind of saw what he wanted to see. But Hubble remained convinced. Then the haunting took a terrifying turn. Small fires began appearing under mysterious circumstances, like a dress hanging in a room suddenly ignited. A piece of cloth burst into flames. Random things throughout the house would just spontaneously catch fire. These incidents terrified the family. Unlike knocks and moving objects, fire could kill everybody. Now the danger felt imminent on top of already being unpredictable. No one knew where the next blaze might start, and no one knew whether they would be able to stop it in time. Eventually, the family reached a conclusion. Whether the disturbances were supernatural or not, Esther appeared to be at the center of them. And maybe distance would help. Maybe a change of environment would end the phenomenon. So arrangements were made for Esther to leave. The hope was simple. Remove Esther from the house, and you remove the problem. But if witnesses were correct, the problem wasn't attached to the house at all. It was attached to Esther herself, and wherever she went next, the mystery would follow. By now, Esther Cox's life had been almost unbearable. Wherever she went, stories followed, and people stared and whispered. Some pitied her, others thought she was just looking for attention. A few were convinced she was possessed. And after months of disturbances, the constant attention was taking its toll on her. The family hoped that removing Esther from the home would finally end the nightmare. They hoped that it was connected to the house and not Esther, and that maybe she was just a major target. They hoped that if Esther stayed away long enough, whatever's going on would just begin to leave her alone. They thought maybe a fresh start would solve everything. So Esther left. And at first, the move seemed promising. The activity did seem to lessen. The knocks became less frequent, and the house tensions kind of started to ease. For the first time in months, it looked like the ordeal may finally be ending. With her newly found independence, Esther went to work on a farm nearby, but still far enough to feel the distance from home. And the arrangement seemed ideal. She could earn money and escape the rumors while she worked to rebuild her life. And for a short time, everything was normal. The disturbances that had plagued her started to feel distant, like a bad memory that's finally beginning to fade. But then one afternoon, something happened that would change the course of the entire case. A fire suddenly broke out inside the farmhouse. It was discovered before it could consume the structure, but it was still alarming enough to trigger immediate suspicion. People remembered the stories from Amherst and the weird incidents and the unexplained fires, along with the rumors that surrounded Esther. And now another fire had appeared where she happened to be living. For some, the connection seemed obvious, like too obvious. Authorities were notified, and they began asking questions. Before long, attention turned toward Esther herself. For nearly a year, Esther had been portrayed as the victim of some invisible force, the young woman trapped in the center of a mystery she could not control. But now that image began to shift. Suddenly, the skeptics seemed a little bit more reasonable. People started asking uncomfortable questions, like, what if the disturbances weren't supernatural? What if someone had been causing them? And if that were true, who stood at the center of every reported event? And that's Esther. The suspicion grew, and eventually authorities decided to act. The news shocked Amherst. Esther Cox was arrested for arson. The charges were centered on the farmhouse fire. Officials believed that there was enough evidence to bring charges, and suddenly, the woman who had spent months claiming to be terrorized by unseen forces found herself facing a very human threat: the legal system. For supporters, the arrest felt deeply unfair. They believed that Esther had endured months of suffering. They pointed to the witnesses, the doctor, the neighbors, the family, Walter Hubble, all the people who claimed to have seen inexplicable events. How could one young lady possibly orchestrate all of that? But the skeptics believed that the haunting had been exaggerated from the start, and maybe the fires were exactly what they appeared to be, just destruction perpetrated by a troubled woman seeking attention or sympathy. When the case reached court, the town was captivated. By now, Esther's name was known throughout the region. The proceedings attracted enormous interest, yet despite the sensational nature of the haunting allegations, the trial itself focused on a much simpler question. Did Esther deliberately start the fire? Witnesses testified, arguments were presented, and the debate went back and forth, but eventually a verdict was reached. Esther was convicted and sentenced to 4 months in jail. For believers in the haunting, the outcome felt like just this horrible injustice. The woman had been tormented all this time only to be sent to jail for something she didn't do. For skeptics, it was confirmation that the entire thing had been built on deception. Either way, Esther served only a small portion of her sentence before being released. And after her release, the disturbances began fading. One of the strangest aspects of the Great Amherst mystery is how it ended. There was no dramatic exorcism, no final confrontation or climactic revelation. The activity just fizzled out. The knocks became less and less frequent. The fires stopped. There were no more objects thrown around the house. Months passed, then years, and the haunting gradually faded into memory. The extraordinary events that had consumed Amherst seemed to come to an end. Years later, Walter Hubbell published a detailed account of the case. The book preserved the testimony of witnesses and his own observations. Without Hubbell, the Great Amherst mystery may have vanished into local folklore. Instead, it became one of the most discussed paranormal cases in Canadian history. His work remains the primary source for much of what we know about the alleged haunting. And that fact introduces another layer of mystery, because so much depends on whether Hubbell was a careful observer or an enthusiastic believer who interpreted ordinary events through a supernatural lens. Today's researchers generally divide into several camps. Believers argue that the sheer number of witnesses makes the case difficult to dismiss. They point to the doctors who reported unusual events, visitors, witnesses, and the consistency of many accounts. To them, Amherst represents one of history's strongest poltergeist cases. Others believe Esther deliberately staged at least some of the instances. They note the lack of physical evidence, contradictions in certain reports, and the later arson conviction. From this perspective, the haunting was an elaborate deception that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Perhaps the most intriguing explanation focuses on trauma. Remember where this story began, with violence and fear, with the attempted assault by Bob McNeil. Modern psychologists have noted that many historical poltergeist cases involve individuals experiencing extreme emotional stress. Some researchers believe that Esther's trauma may have contributed to the events, whether consciously or unconsciously. In this interpretation, the haunting becomes less of a ghost story and more of a tragedy. Nearly 150 years later, no one can say with certainty what happened inside the Amherst house. Were objects truly flying across rooms? Did messages really appear on walls? Was an unseen force attacking Esther Cox? Or was the whole mystery just a product of fear, trauma, rumor, and belief? We may never know. That's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. If you enjoyed the story, please remember to like and follow. It helps a lot. Until next time, stay safe and keep watch, because legends may live.